So, Jonathan, in terms of these limitations basically been to Sydney in the past 14 days, you still can't go. The Queensland government not confident community transmission is low enough.
No, that's right, Tom. Good afternoon. We just had a very testy press conference with the Premier, the Chief Health Officer, as well as we start to learn about these new rules allowing people to travel into Queensland. Effectively, if you live inside the Sydney basin, you can't travel to Queensland. If you live outside that area, it's suggested around 4 million odd people actually live inside that Sydney basin. If you live outside of that, you can begin to resume your travels to Queensland from the 3rd of November. That date's been pushed back somewhat, but it creates all sorts of questions and uncertainties. If you've travelled into Sydney within a 14-day period, you can't come to Queensland. You also have the question which gets raised about what about if people from Sydney have actually been to your region. There's obviously one of the great problems is the asymptomatic people, those who are carrying the virus but perhaps don't know they have it. So the Premier has announced this position. The Prime Minister has also talked extensively about opening back up for Christmas, but it now appears that if there's the slightest spread of the disease into these regional communities, then that won't be happening. This is what the Premier had to say.
I kept my commitment. I'm honest with the people of Queensland. That is what I said I would do, and that is exactly what I've done. I've accepted her recommendations to me, lock, stock and barrel.
Yeah, Tom, the pressure was also put on the Chief Health Officer as well to try and explain the reasons for this modelling. There still seems to be some sort of belief that Queensland's tracing system isn't up to scratch with New South Wales, because if it was, they certainly wouldn't be having the problems with allowing some people to enter the state. Anastasia Palaszczuk is absolutely adamant that 1 or 2 cases could easily spiral into what they've seen down in Victoria. Obviously, we've seen a number of elderly communities who are completely in support of this policy, others perhaps opposed to it. But the Chief Health Officer made the point that if this virus spreads to a community outside of that Sydney area, then potentially that could actually stop those regional communities or those areas outside of Sydney. You're talking about perhaps the Hunter region, you might be talking about down in Wollongong, or those areas closer to Canberra, perhaps like Goulburn. They wouldn't be allowed to travel into Brisbane or into Queensland either. It certainly doesn't give the certainty that a number of tourism businesses and companies are looking for at this stage. If they can be shut back down with one case, you start to ask how difficult is it to restock? How do they go about reopening their businesses? Here's Jeanette Young.
They had a hard start because of those cases that came into New South Wales from Melbourne, and it's taken them a while to get on top of those original cases. And we can see that their biggest risk is still that southwestern part of Sydney. That's where they're continuing to have those cases, and then every so often they'll have cases elsewhere in Sydney because people from that area have gone there, seeded an outbreak.
Now, Tom, one of the obvious problems here is going to be how do you determine those people who live in the Sydney basin? A lot of people wouldn't know if they're actually on the border, they're inside it, or they're outside. You can actually be quite close to Sydney CBD by comparison to if you lived in Penrith, for instance, where it stretches out all the way to the Blue Mountains, the northwest of Sydney. You can actually be just outside of what's termed to be the Sydney Artesian Basin. So the police, we assume, are going to have the access to mobile phones and iPads to be able to look at where people are actually from. The police officers themselves, or senior police here, say there will be a sympathetic approach to work with people if somebody perhaps doesn't quite understand the system. They didn't say that people will be thrown back on a plane and sent back home, but it will certainly create confusion for a number of people as they try and determine where their LGA is, where they live, whether they fall inside that area or outside, and actually have they been to Sydney or not in the past 14 days. It seems the one exception is if you're driving to Sydney to go to the airport, you'll then be allowed to fly into Queensland. You obviously wouldn't want to stop for petrol on the way, because then that would put you in the middle of what Queensland determines to be a hotspot.